The water's surface reflects the July full moon. It is the early morning of July 4th, 1969. At the bottom of a Victorian swimming pool in Sussex, England, floats the motionless body of a 27-year-old man. His blonde hair ripples gently underwater like golden seaweed. Around him, empty bottles and cigarette butts float on the surface. This is no ordinary man. He is Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones. The musical genius who, just 3 weeks earlier, had been kicked out of his own band. The man who gave name, sound, and soul to the British rock revolution. And now he lies dead on the same property where Winnie the Pooh once lived. Sirens shatter the silence of the English countryside. Paramedics attempt to resuscitate him for 45 minutes. It's no use. At 12:10 in the morning, Brian Jones is officially declared dead. The official cause, drowning under the influence of alcohol. But in the following 5 decades, this version would be challenged time and again. Witnesses changing their testimonies. Forensic evidence that didn't match up. Deathbed confessions. A builder with blood on his hands. And one question that would never go away. Was it really an accident? To understand how a jazz prodigy ended up drowning in his own swimming pool, we must go back in time. Cheltenham, England. February 1942. The world is at war, but Lewis Brian Hopkins Jones is born into a middle-class home. His father is an aeronautical engineer, his mother a piano teacher. Music flows through the walls of that house from the very first day. Brian is a brilliant child, with a superior IQ. By 9, he's mastered the piano. By 12, the clarinet and the saxophone. His teachers predict a dazzling future for him. But Brian has a problem. He finds authority unbearable, and rules, mere suggestions he can ignore. At 14, Brian discovers something that will change his life forever: American blues. Muddy Waters, Elmore James, Chuck Berry. That forbidden, dark, sexual music that comes from the Mississippi and speaks of pain, desire, and freedom. Brian is mesmerized. He abandons the classical clarinet for the slide guitar. He lets his hair grow long. He starts dressing differently. In conservative 1950s England, this is practically a declaration of war. His parents are horrified. His school expels him for misconduct. At 16, Brian gets his first girlfriend pregnant. Then a second. At 17, he has 2 children with 2 different women, and he takes no responsibility for either of them. 1962. Brian is 20 years old and has an obsession to form the best rhythm and blues band in England. He leaves Cheltenham and arrives in London with a guitar, 30 pounds, and a dream. He stays in miserable apartments, sleeps on other people's sofas, lives off handouts, and plays in pubs for spare change. But Brian has something no one else possesses: vision. He doesn't just want to play the blues. He wants to live it. He wants to be the first white British musician to capture the essence of the Mississippi. And he has the talent to do it. His slide guitar is hypnotic. His dedication, obsessive. He places an ad in Jazz News looking for musicians who share his passion. At a club called the Ealing Jazz Club, Brian meets Ian Stewart, a robust and reliable boogie-woogie pianist. Then a young, middle-class singer named Mick Jagger appears, along with his guitarist friend Keith Richards. Brian assesses them critically. Jagger has charisma, but little technique. Richards has feeling, but inconsistent discipline. It doesn't matter. Brian sees potential. More importantly, he sees that he can lead them. In May of 1962, Brian does something that will change the history of rock. He calls the Marquee Club and books a show under the name The Rolling Stones, taking the name from a Muddy Waters song. Brian Jones has just founded the Rolling Stones. He is the leader. He chooses the name. He recruits the members. He negotiates the first contracts. The Stones are his vision, his baby, his legacy. The next 18 months are pure euphoria. The Stones become the most dangerous band in England. While the Beatles are endearing and confident, the Stones are sexual and menacing. And at the center of that image is Brian, beautiful, androgynous, wild, with his golden hair and silk shirts. It was Brian who appeared on the covers of the first magazines. Brian who received the first fan letters. Brian who experimented with sitars, dulcimers, and marimbas, transforming simple blues songs into complex soundscapes. On the early recordings, he was the lead guitarist, not Keith Richards. But there are tensions beneath the glittering surface. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards begin writing songs together, encouraged by manager Andrew Loog Oldham, who sees them as the band's commercial future. Brian feels betrayed like a knife in the back. He founded this band. He's the most talented musician. Why are Jagger and Richards getting all the credit? Brian begins to subtly sabotage himself. He arrives late to rehearsals. He experiments too much in the studio, delaying recordings. His perfectionism turns into obstructionism. And then there's his other problem, the one that will eventually destroy him. Brian can't resist women, and he can't resist drugs. 1965. The Rolling Stones are giants. They've conquered America. They have worldwide hits. But Brian is falling apart. His girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, is the most beautiful and dangerous woman in London. His drug use is legendary. LSD, cocaine, amphetamines, anything to numb the pain of feeling replaced in his own band. In photographs from that era, Brian appears distant. Glassy eyes, forced smile. While Jagger and Richards solidified as the creative core of the Stones, Brian became a decorative figure. Brilliant, yes. Essential to the sound, absolutely. But a leader? Those days are over. And this is just the beginning of the fall. Because what awaits Brian Jones over the next 4 years is a downward spiral of betrayal, paranoia, addiction, and ultimately, death. A death that, 50 years later, remains an unsolved mystery. It's 1967. Brian has been arrested for drug possession. The British press crucifies him. While the Beatles are pardoned, Brian is made a scapegoat. The British establishment has decided that the Rolling Stones, and especially Brian Jones, represent everything that is wrong with modern youth. His mental health deteriorates. Chronic asthma, panic attacks, drug-induced paranoia. He can no longer play with his former precision. During the recording sessions for crucial albums like Beggar's Banquet, Brian is frequently absent, either physically or mentally. Keith Richards fully assumes the role of lead guitarist. Brian has become a ghost in his own band. But the real betrayal is yet to come, and when it arrives, it will be devastating. The desert sun beats down on the Medina of Marrakesh. Brian Jones, Anita Pallenberg, and Keith Richards are on holiday, escaping the pressures of London. But this is no relaxing getaway. It's the scene of one of the greatest betrayals in rock history. Brian, increasingly paranoid and addicted, falls ill during the trip. He has to be hospitalized. While he lies in a Moroccan hospital bed, the unthinkable happens. Keith Richards seduces Anita Pallenberg. Or she seduces him. It depends on who you ask. What is indisputable is that when Brian leaves the hospital, he discovers that his girlfriend and his best friend have fallen in love. Brian is devastated. It's not just the loss of Anita, the woman he loved. It's the confirmation of what he suspected. He's no longer part of the inner circle. Keith has replaced him in everything. First on guitar, then in songwriting, now in love. The original Stones trinity, Jagger, Richards, Jones, has become Jagger-Richards, with Brian as a dispensable appendage. Photographs from that time show the transformation. Brian goes from being the most beautiful and photogenic Stone to a bloated, pale, sickly figure. Alcohol and drugs bloat him. His skin takes on a yellowish hue. His eyes, once bright and defiant, now reflect defeat and confusion. May 1967. British police raid Keith Richards' mansion in Redlands. Mick, Keith, and art collector Robert Fraser are arrested for drug possession. Brian, who isn't present, suspects a conspiracy. Why did the police choose that specific moment? Who betrayed them? Brian's paranoia has some basis. Scotland Yard has a special squad dedicated to hunting down the Rolling Stones. The British establishment considers them a moral threat, and Brian, with his previous arrests, is the most vulnerable target. But the conspiracy Brian imagines goes beyond the police. He begins to believe that his own bandmates want to eliminate him. Ironically, while Brian was personally falling apart, musically he still delivered moments of brilliance. In We Love You, he played the mellotron with haunting mastery. In She's a Rainbow, his piano created a dreamy atmosphere. In Ruby Tuesday, his recorder defined the song. Brian is a musical chameleon. He's a master of over 30 instruments. While Keith specializes in guitar and Mick in vocals, Brian can pick up a sitar, a dulcimer, a marimba, a saxophone, and extract exactly the sound a song needs. He's the most versatile musician in the Stones. But in the rock business, versatility matters less than consistency and reliability. And Brian is being painfully inconsistent. 1968. Brian moves between London apartments, each more run down than the last. His days blur into a haze of pills, whiskey, and concerned visitors trying to rescue him. But Brian doesn't want to be rescued. He wants to numb the pain of having lost his identity. The other Stones increasingly avoid him. Recording sessions are scheduled without notifying him. When he does show up, he often can't play. His hands tremble. His concentration is non-existent. On several songs on Beggar's Banquet, his contributions are replaced by other musicians. Brian Jones is being erased from the Rolling Stones, one note at a time. In a final attempt to reconnect with himself, Brian traveled to Morocco again, this time alone, with a portable recorder. He spent weeks in the Rif Mountains, recording the Jagger musicians, preserving an ancient musical tradition. The result was Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jagger, an album of traditional Moroccan music released posthumously. It's a brilliant piece of work, ahead of its time. Brian isn't simply appropriating exotic music. He's documenting it with respect and precision. For a moment, he seems to have found a purpose beyond the Stones. But it's too little, too late. The band has already made up its mind. June 1969. Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Charlie Watts drive to Cochford Farm, Brian's new property in Sussex. The house has history. It's where A. Milne wrote Winnie the Pooh. Brian bought it because he wanted a refuge from the chaos of London. He wanted to rebuild himself, maybe form a new band, reinvent himself. But this visit isn't friendly. The three remaining Stones have come with an ultimatum that's really a dismissal. Brian can't continue with the upcoming U.S. tour. He can't get a visa because of his drug arrests. His reliability is non-existent. It's time for him to go. The conversation is awkward and one-sided. Mick tries to be diplomatic. Keith is more direct. Charlie remains silent, uncomfortable. Brian listens, surprisingly calm. Perhaps he already knew. Perhaps it's a relief. He negotiates financial compensation. He'll receive £100,000 a year, a considerable sum at that time. On June 13, 1969, the Rolling Stones issued an official statement. Brian Jones had left the band due to musical differences. The phrase was a polite lie. It wasn't musical differences. It was self-destruction, betrayal, addiction, and the cold, calculated business of a band that could no longer afford to carry its most brilliant but least functional member. Brian is left alone at Cochford Farm with his new girlfriend, Anna Wolin, a young Swedish woman who seems to genuinely love him. For the first time in years, Brian talks about plans. He wants to form a new band. He wants to prove he still has what it takes. He wants to show the world that he, not Jagger and Richards, is the true genius of the Stones. But his actions tell a different story. He drinks heavily. He mixes alcohol with pills. He hires construction workers to renovate the pool, including a man named Frank Thorogood, who, according to some later accounts, has a strained relationship with Brian. There are arguments about money, shoddy workmanship, and respect. July 3, 1969. Brian Jones's last day begins ordinarily. The weather is warm, the sky blue. Brian seems more cheerful than he has been in weeks. He talks to Anna about the future. He listens to his new Jimi Hendrix records. In the afternoon, some visitors arrive, Frank Thorogood and his girlfriend, plus another worker. They drink together. They smoke. Afternoon turns into evening. Eventually, they decide to go swimming. Brian, despite having asthma and being under the influence of multiple substances, insists on getting in the pool. The others follow him. The atmosphere is festive, but with an underlying tension that Anna can't quite place. It's approximately 11:30 at night. What happens in the next hour will change everything. And depending on who you believe, it's either a tragic accident or a cover-up murder. The official version is simple. Brian Jones, intoxicated and suffering from asthma, decided to go for a night swim. He entered the illuminated pool at Cochford Farm. Sometime between 11:30 and midnight, he drowned. By the time Anna Wolin and Frank Thorogood finally pulled him from the water, it was too late. But even from the beginning, this version has inconsistencies. Anna says he was only gone for a few minutes. Frank Thorogood says Brian seemed fine, swimming normally, until suddenly he wasn't. The third witness, Janet Lawson, Thorogood's girlfriend, gives a slightly different version each time she recounts it. The coroner examining Brian's body finds something disturbing. His liver is severely damaged from years of alcohol abuse. His lungs show signs of chronic disease. but the immediate cause of death is listed as drowning under the influence of alcohol and drugs. His blood alcohol level is 3 times the legal limit for driving. There are also traces of asthma medication. What the coroner doesn't find is equally significant: no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no evidence that Brian was held underwater against his will. The verdict is death by misfortune, essentially an accident. Case closed. 5 days after Brian's death, the Rolling Stones held a free concert in Hyde Park, London. Before 500,000 people, Mick Jagger appeared dressed in a white leprechaun robe, read a poem by Shelley in Brian's memory, and thousands of white butterflies were released. It was a beautiful and theatrical gesture, but it's also unsettling. Brian has barely been dead a week, and the Stones are already on stage with his replacement, Mick Taylor, an extraordinarily talented young guitarist. The Rolling Stones machine doesn't stop. It can't stop. Brian is briefly commemorated and then, effectively, forgotten. In the following months, rumors began to circulate. People who had been at Cochford Farm that night started talking, discreetly, in pubs and at parties. Frank Thorogood, some said, had had a falling out with Brian earlier that day. It was said that Brian had fired him or threatened not to pay him. Others whispered that Thorogood had connections with local criminals. Anna Wolin, Brian's Swedish girlfriend, has never been comfortable with the official version of events. In later interviews, she hints that there was more to that night than what was revealed. She says that when Brian was pulled from the water, his body was covered in bruises that weren't there before. Were they caused by resuscitation attempts or something more sinister? The Rolling Stones, notably, say very little about Brian after his death. There is no tribute album. There is no authorized documentary. In interviews, Mick and Keith speak of Brian with a mixture of sadness and exasperation, as if he were a troubled brother who inevitably and predictably self-destructed. Keith Richards, in his memoir Life, published decades later, is particularly harsh. He describes Brian as a paranoid narcissist whose talent was overshadowed by his weakness of character. Mick Jagger is more diplomatic, but equally distant. It's as if they want to bury Brian not only physically, but also historically. During the 70s and 80s, Brian's death became a footnote in the Rolling Stones mythology. The band continued to grow, becoming one of the biggest in the world. Mick Taylor proved to be a brilliant guitarist, though he too would eventually leave. Then came Ronnie Wood. The Stones went on, immortal. But Brian remains frozen at 27, joining that cursed club of rock stars who died at that specific age: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison. Except that, unlike those others, Brian didn't die in dramatic circumstances of overdose or obvious self-destruction. He died in his own swimming pool in a small English village, supposedly by accident. 20 years after Brian's death, Frank Thorogood is dying of cancer. According to Rolling Stones driver Tom Keelock, who was close to Thorogood, the builder makes a deathbed confession. Thorogood allegedly tells Keelock, "I killed Brian Jones. I drowned him in the pool." Keelock reveals this confession years later, triggering a new wave of speculation. Is it true? Or is it the exaggeration of a dying man, tormented by guilt or seeking attention? Thorogood cannot be questioned because he is already dead. And Keelock, although he insists the confession was real, has no proof beyond Thorogood's word. In 2009, 40 years after Brian's death, investigative journalist Scott Jones, no relation, publishes an extensive investigation into the case. He interviews surviving witnesses, examines previously classified police documents, and constructs an alternative case. According to their investigation, Frank Thorogood had both motive and opportunity. There was financial tension between him and Brian. Thorogood was present at the pool, and several witnesses recalled that Thorogood seemed strangely aggressive that night. More revealing, the police never properly investigated. They didn't thoroughly interview the witnesses. They didn't rigorously examine the crime scene. It seemed they simply wanted to close the case quickly. Brian's family, led by his sister Barbara, is demanding that the case be reopened. They are requesting permission to exhume his body and perform a new autopsy using modern technology. They argue that the original investigation was negligent, that there is sufficient circumstantial evidence to warrant a new review, and that Brian deserves justice. British authorities refuse. They say there isn't enough new evidence to justify the exhumation, that too many years have passed, that the main witnesses are dead, The case remains officially closed, although unofficially, everyone knows it's riddled with holes. Today, more than 50 years later, Brian Jones's death remains one of rock's great mysteries. There are three main theories. 1. It was a tragic but foreseeable accident, the result of years of substance abuse. 2. It was murder committed by Frank Thorogood, motivated by money or temper. 3. It was something in between, perhaps a fight gone wrong, or a cruel prank that ended in tragedy. What is undeniable is that Brian Jones died alone, betrayed, and is largely forgotten. The man who founded the Rolling Stones, who gave them their name, their initial sound, their rebellious aesthetic, has been reduced to a footnote. And that, regardless of exactly how he died, is the real tragedy. To understand why Brian's loss was so significant, we must examine his true legacy, his musical genius. Brian Jones wasn't simply a good guitarist. He was a sonic alchemist who transformed exotic instruments into essential elements of rock. In an era when most rock bands used guitar, bass, and drums, Brian introduced impossible textures. In Paint It Black, it's his sitar that creates that dark, psychedelic atmosphere. In Under My Thumb, his marimba defines the groove. In Lady Jane, his Renaissance dulcimer transports the song to another age. Brian could hear an instrument once and master it in days. This talent didn't appear out of nowhere. Brian began his formal musical education at age 9 with classical piano. His mother, a music teacher, trained him rigorously. Unlike most self-taught rock musicians, Brian could read sheet music, understood music theory, and had conservatory-level discipline. When he discovered jazz at the age of 12, he applied that same discipline. He practiced saxophone 4 or 5 hours a day. He transcribed Charlie Parker's solos note for note. He studied the blues masters as if they were sacred texts. By the time he arrived in London at the age of 20, Brian had already accumulated more than 10,000 hours of serious musical practice. But Brian's true genius lay in slide guitar. This technique, originating in the Mississippi Delta, requires exquisite control. The player slides a glass or metal tube across the strings, creating sounds that cry, moan, and sing. It's incredibly difficult to master. But Brian did. Listen to No Expectations from 1968. Brian's slide guitar is heartbreaking, spoken, almost human. Or I Want to Be Your Man from the early Stones days, where his slide captures the raw essence of Chicago blues. Brian wasn't imitating the blues, he was channeling it. He was the first white British musician to truly understand the soul of that music. Brian was also an obsessive collector of rare instruments. He visited antique instrument shops in London, searching for forgotten treasures. He bought instruments from cultures all over the world. Sitars from India, dulcimers from Persia, bamboo flutes from Japan, African harps. He didn't collect them as decoration. He studied them, mastered them, and incorporated them into Stones recordings. On Ruby Tuesday, his recorder creates a Renaissance melancholy. On Street Fighting Man, his electric sitar adds exotic tension. Brian saw the Rolling Stones not as a traditional blues band, but as a laboratory for global sonic experimentation. What many don't know is that Brian effectively functioned as a co-producer on the Stones' early albums. While Andrew Loog Oldham, the official manager, handled the business aspects, Brian was in the studio suggesting arrangements, experimenting with recording techniques, and adding layers of texture. On 1967's Their Satanic Majesty's Request, the Stones' most experimental psychedelic album, Brian's fingerprints are everywhere. Atmospheric mellotrons, reverse tape effects, processed instruments. Although Mick and Keith wrote the songs, Brian sculpted the sound. Yet he received little credit. Brian's innovation influenced a generation of musicians. Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin admitted that he studied Brian's recording techniques. Pete Townsend of The Who spoke of how Brian legitimized the use of non-traditional instruments in rock. George Harrison of the Beatles drew inspiration from Brian's experiments with Indian music. When Brian recorded with the musicians of Jajouka in Morocco, he was anticipating the concept of world music by decades. He was doing what artists like Peter Gabriel and Paul Simon would later do with cross-cultural collaborations. Brian wasn't appropriating other cultures. He was honoring them, documenting them, and weaving them into his own musical vision. But Brian's genius also had a dark side. His perfectionism was paralyzing. In the studio, he could spend hours trying to capture a specific sound. He experimented endlessly, delaying sessions and frustrating his bandmates. What he saw as art, others began to see as unproductive obsession. There are stories of Brian recording the same guitar part 30, 40 times, never satisfied, or insisting that the whole band learn a new instrument for a song they wouldn't eventually use. This perfectionism stemmed from a deep insecurity. Brian knew that as a songwriter he was inferior to Jagger and Richards, so he compensated by being indispensable in other areas. As his addiction worsened, Brian's musical talent visibly deteriorated. His hands trembled too much for him to play accurately. His timing became erratic. His musical memory, once photographic, was now hazy. For a musician whose entire identity was built on technical excellence, this loss was devastating. During the 1968 Beggars Banquet sessions, there were times when Brian simply couldn't play. The others waited patiently, then grew frustrated, then replaced his parts with other musicians. Brian sat in a corner of the studio, aware of his inability, sinking deeper into depression and drugs. It was a brutal, vicious cycle. After Brian's death, the Rolling Stones carried on, but something changed in their sound. They became more direct, more focused on hard rock. The exotic textures disappeared. The experiments with unusual instruments ceased. Mick Taylor was a technically superior guitarist to Brian, but he wasn't a sonic visionary. Albums like Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main St. are rock and roll masterpieces, but they're fundamentally different from the albums Brian contributed to. They're more consistent, perhaps, but less adventurous. Brian's unpredictability, that willingness to try anything, had given the Stones an element of creative danger they never fully recaptured. Decades after his death, musicians and critics have begun to reassess Brian's contribution. Artists such as Beck, Tom York, and Jack White have cited the Stones' early recordings, those that most prominently feature Brian, as key influences. The album Brian Jones Presents the Pipes of Pan at Jagger, recorded in Morocco months before his death, has been recognized as a pioneering work in ethnomusicology. Philip Glass praised it. World music musicians see him as a spiritual ancestor. Brian Jones wasn't just a founding member of the Rolling Stones. He was the architect of their sound, the experimenter who transformed a blues band into a cutting-edge force. And when he died, he took with him musical possibilities that were never explored. That is the true cost of his untimely loss. To understand Brian Jones's downfall, we must discuss something uncomfortable: his relationship with women. Brian was irresistibly attractive. Golden blonde hair that fell in perfect waves, deep blue-green eyes, sculpted cheekbones, full lips. In an era of rugged masculinity, Brian was beautiful in an almost feminine way, and he used that beauty ruthlessly. At 16, he got his first girlfriend, Valerie, pregnant. He didn't marry her. He didn't raise the child. At 17, he repeated the pattern with another young woman, Pat Andrews. 2 children before he was 18, neither properly acknowledged. For Brian, the consequences were something others had to deal with. In London, Brian met Linda Lawrence, a teenager from a conservative family. They fell in love, or at least Linda fell in love. Brian got her pregnant. She gave birth to their son in 1964, hoping Brian would keep his promise to marry her. He never did. Linda raised the boy, Julian, alone for years. Brian would occasionally appear, play the loving father for a day, then disappear for months. He offered no consistent financial support. He offered no emotional presence. For Brian, fatherhood was an abstract concept, not a concrete responsibility. Then Anita Pallenberg arrived in 1965, and everything changed. Anita wasn't an innocent fan or a submissive girlfriend. She was an Italian model, actress, multilingual, intelligent, dangerous. She was as addicted to drugs as Brian, as sexually liberated, as culturally sophisticated. They were a perfectly toxic couple. Anita transformed Brian. She refined his style, making him more androgynous and exotic. She introduced avant-garde ideas, Eastern philosophies, and experiments with harder drugs. Together, they were the most fascinating couple in London, beautiful, decadent, terrifying. But they also destroyed each other. Violent fights, pathological jealousy, mutual infidelity. What few knew at the time, Brian could be violent with women. Pat Andrews, the mother of his second child, later revealed that Brian hit her during their relationship. Anita Pallenberg also reported physical violence during his drug-induced paranoia episodes. When Brian was scared or enraged, he resorted to physical aggression. This complicates the narrative. Brian was a victim of betrayal, addiction, and the pressures of fame. But he was also a perpetrator. The fragility of his ego, fueled by deep insecurity, manifested as abusive control over his partners. It was a pattern that began in his teens and that he never resolved. When Keith Richards stole Anita from him in Morocco in 1967, it wasn't just a romantic betrayal. It was confirmation of Brian's inferiority. Anita, the only woman who seemed his equal, had chosen Keith. And she did so publicly, humiliatingly. Brian never recovered. The photographs of Anita and Keith together are deliberately provocative. Keith posed with Anita in photo shoots that Brian clearly witnessed. It was as if they wanted to rub their new relationship in his face. And it worked. Brian fell apart. His drug use increased. He became more paranoid. The betrayal broke him. After Anita, Brian tried to move on. He met Suki Poitier, a beautiful model who seemed sweeter, less dangerous than Anita. Suki genuinely loved Brian. She tried to help him cut down on drugs, to get his health back on track. At times, it seemed Brian might be saved. But Brian sabotaged even this relationship. Unable to trust after Anita, he projected his insecurities onto Suki. He accused her of imaginary infidelities. He alternated between adoration and cruelty. Suki finally left, exhausted. Later she would say that loving Brian was like loving a ghost, never fully present, always half-lost in some personal hell. Brian's last girlfriend was Anna Wolin, a young Swedish woman he met in May of 1969. Anna was sweet and optimistic, lacking the harshness of Brian's other women. She believed in him. She believed he could recover. She believed that life at Cochford Farm, far from London, could save him. During the last few weeks of his life, Brian really did seem better. He talked about forming a new band. He cut down on drinking, though he didn't stop. Anna surrounded him with domestic normalcy. For a moment, there was a chance of redemption. Then came the night of July 3rd. Looking back, Brian's relationship with women mirrors his relationship with himself. Intense, chaotic, self-destructive. He sought external validation because he lacked internal self-worth. He seduced compulsively because each conquest was a temporary test of value. But no amount of beauty, sex, or adoration could fill the void within him. This pattern is common in people with early abandonment trauma or insecure attachment. Brian never felt loved enough by his parents, who valued achievement over emotion. He grew up believing he had to perform perfectly to deserve love. When his musical performance declined, his sense of worth collapsed. We also need to provide context. The 1960s, despite their reputation for sexual liberation, were deeply misogynistic. Women were seen as accessories by many rock musicians. Unwanted pregnancies were considered their problem. Domestic violence was rarely discussed or punished. Brian operated within this toxic culture. This doesn't excuse his behavior, but it does partially explain it. Brian, like many men of his generation, never learned to process emotions healthily, to take full responsibility, or to see women as complex human beings rather than muses or possessions. His emotional incapacity contributed as much to his art as to his destruction. Today, Brian Jones's children bear the weight of his absence. Julian Jones, son of Linda Lawrence, grew up without a father. He was eventually adopted by Donovan, the folk singer. Paul Trinka, Brian's biographer, managed to connect with some of these adult children. Their testimonies are moving. They admire their father's talent, but lament his abandonment. Brian Jones left behind at least 5 confirmed children, possibly more. He left behind heartbroken women and altered futures. And he left behind an example of how artistic genius does not equate to human decency. His talent was real. His fragility was real. But his cruelty was real too. The full truth about Brian Jones includes all these facets, not just the romantic or tragic ones. 1967. Britain was changing radically. Young people with long hair were questioning authority, experimenting with drugs, rejecting Victorian values. And the British establishment was terrified. They needed to send a message. They needed a scapegoat. They chose the Rolling Stones. And specifically, they chose Brian Jones. Scotland Yard formed a special unit, the Drug Squad, specifically dedicated to arresting celebrities for drug-related offenses. They weren't after major traffickers or criminal networks. They were after musicians, actors, and artists. And the Rolling Stones, with their rebellious image and influence on youth, were prime targets. May 1966. Police raid Brian's apartment on Courtfield Road, London. They claim to have received an anonymous tip. They find small amounts of cannabis. Brian is arrested, handcuffed, and taken to the station like a violent criminal. Newspapers publish photographs of Brian being escorted by police, head bowed, publicly humiliated. The trial is a media circus. The judge, clearly biased, treats him with disdain. The newspapers portray him as a corrupter of young people. Brian is found guilty and sentenced to 9 months in prison. Although the sentence is eventually reduced on appeal to 3 years of probation and a fine, the damage is done. Brian has a criminal record. Just 9 months later, in February 1967, the police carried out the infamous raid on Keith Richards' country house in Redlands. They arrested Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, and Robert Fraser. Brian wasn't there that night, but the timing was suspicious. Why did the police know exactly when to strike? Who gave them the information? Decades later, it would be revealed that the News of the World, a tabloid newspaper, had collaborated with the police. They had published a defamatory article about Mick Jagger. Jagger threatened them with a lawsuit, and in retaliation, the newspaper leaked information to Scotland Yard. It was a conspiracy between the media and the authorities to destroy the Rolling Stones. May 1967. While Mick and Keith face their own trials, Brian is arrested again by the police. This time, the evidence is even more questionable. Officers claim to have found cannabis in his new apartment. Brian insists it was planted. His lawyer argues that as a constantly hounded public figure, he is an obvious target for planted evidence. It doesn't matter. Brian is found guilty again. This time he receives a 9-month prison sentence. He is sent to Wormwood Scrubs, one of the toughest prisons in England. Brian Jones, a sophisticated and sensitive musician, is in a cell with violent criminals. He lasts only 2 days before suffering a complete nervous breakdown. He is transferred to a psychiatric clinic. The prosecution of the Stones generated an unexpected response: public support. The Times editor, William Rees-Mogg, published an editorial entitled, "Who Breaks a Butterfly on a Wheel?" arguing that the sentences were disproportionately harsh. There were clearly 2 systems of justice, one for ordinary people, another for rebellious young men with long hair. But this support comes too late for Brian. The psychological damage is already done. Brian develops a paranoia that will never go away. He believes, with some justification, that he is constantly being watched, that his phone is tapped, that undercover police officers are following him. And he's right. Scotland Yard kept files on him, monitored his movements, and was waiting for another opportunity to arrest him. The arrests have devastating practical consequences. With a criminal record for drug offenses, Brian is unable to obtain visas for the United States, the most lucrative market for the Rolling Stones. The band tours enormously successfully across America, and Brian has to remain in England, temporarily replaced by other musicians. This exclusion torments him. He watches his bandmates on television, performing on The Ed Sullivan Show, receiving standing ovations in stadiums. He founded this band. He named it. And now he can't even tour with them. The paranoia intensifies. Are they planning to replace him permanently? Are they secretly enjoying his absence? Is it easier to work without him? May 1968. Incredibly, Brian is arrested for the 3rd time. This time there aren't even any drugs in his apartment when the police arrive. But they do find some cannabis in a drawer. Brian maintains it was planted by his previous landlord or by the police themselves. The pattern of persecution is now undeniable. During this trial, Brian's psychiatrist testifies about his fragile mental state. He explains that another incarceration could lead to suicide. The judge, finally showing some compassion, sentences him only to a fine. But he adds a chilling warning. This is your last chance. If you appear before this court again, you will go to prison for a very long time. By 1969, Brian's paranoia is complete. He believes his house is bugged, that strangers on the street are undercover cops, that his mail is being hacked, that his friends are reporting his activities to the authorities. Some of these beliefs are true. Others are delusions amplified by years of LSD and amphetamine use. Anna Wolin, his last girlfriend, describes living with Brian as being in a psychological prison. He insisted on closing all the curtains. He spoke in whispers even inside his own home. He constantly changed his routines to avoid being predictable. The musical genius who was once so confident and charismatic was now a frightened shadow of his former self. The persecution of Brian Jones by the British establishment reveals something sinister about state power. It wasn't an impartial application of the law. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy countercultural figures who challenged social norms. Brian was gay-friendly in an era of homosexual criminalization. He was sexually liberated in a puritanical society. He experimented with drugs in a culture of prohibition. The establishment couldn't tolerate his visible existence, so they used the law as a weapon. And it worked. By 1969, Brian Jones was broken, physically, mentally, and spiritually. The arrests, the trials, the public humiliation, the inability to work normally, all contributed to his final collapse. The question remains, if they had left Brian alone, would he have survived? The persecution of Brian Jones was an early chapter in the war on drugs that would devastate millions in the decades to come. It wasn't about public health or safety. It was about social control, about disciplining those who refused to conform. Brian Jones was one of the first and most visible martyrs of this war. Today, with cannabis legalized in many jurisdictions, Brian's convictions seem absurd. He was imprisoned, humiliated, and broken for possessing amounts that would now be legal or result in a minor fine. But the damage is done. Brian is dead, and the forces that persecuted him continued to persecute countless others, disproportionately poor and people of color, in a war that should never have been started. 27 years old. For most people, it's an age of possibility, of young adult energy. But in rock mythology, 27 is the age of death. Brian Jones died at 27. Jimi Hendrix, 27. Janis Joplin, 27. Jim Morrison, 27. Kurt Cobain, 27. Amy Winehouse, 27. It's a coincidence that feels like a pattern, a curse that feels like fate. Brian was one of the first to join this cursed club. His death in July 1969 opened a template that others would follow. And the similarities are disturbing. All were exceptional musicians. All struggled with addiction. All faced immense pressures of fame. All died in circumstances involving drugs or alcohol. All left behind incomplete legacies. September 1970. Just 14 months after Brian, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He choked on his own vomit after mixing sleeping pills and wine. Jimi and Brian knew each other. They respected each other as musical innovators. Jimi had visited Brian at Cochford Farm months before his death. They talked about forming a band together. That dream died with Brian. The circumstances of Jimi's death also spawned conspiracy theories. Was it an accident or murder? His girlfriend that night, Monica Damon, gave conflicting accounts. Jimi's manager had financial motives for his death. As with Brian, the official narrative feels unsatisfying, riddled with convenient holes. October 1970. 3 weeks after Jimi, Janis Joplin died of a heroin overdose in a Los Angeles hotel. 27 years old. Janis, like Brian, was a tortured perfectionist. She used drugs and alcohol to silence the voices of self-doubt. She sang with her whole soul, pouring all her pain into every note, then needed anesthesia to survive the drain. Janis never met Brian personally, but she understood his dilemma. Exceptional talent often comes with exceptional sensitivity. Feeling everything so intensely, the music, the love, the rejection, the pressure, becomes unbearable. Drugs offer a temporary respite from the intensity. But the respite becomes dependence. Dependence becomes death. July 1971. Exactly 2 years after Brian Jones, Jim Morrison of The Doors died in a bathtub in Paris. Officially, heart failure. There was no autopsy. His body was buried quickly. The exact circumstances remain murky. Morrison was 27 years old. Jim and Brian shared more than just a similar age. They shared a performance of self-destruction. Both used their own lives as art, pushing boundaries to the breaking point. Both knew they were dying. They spoke openly about it with friends, but they couldn't or wouldn't stop. Death had become part of their mystique, almost an accepted destiny. By the early 70s, the 27 Club was a recognizable phenomenon. 4 rock icons, all dead within 2 years, all at the same age. The media began to speculate. Was it a coincidence, or was there something about being 27 that made musicians particularly vulnerable? Psychologists offered explanations. 27 is when the brain finishes developing completely. It's when many people with mental health disorders experience their first major crises. It's the age when the consequences of years of substance abuse begin to accumulate fatally. It's when the pressure to maintain early success becomes overwhelming. After Morrison, the 27 Club went into an odd hiatus. Decades passed without any prominent additions. Musicians were still dying young, but not specifically at 27. The curse seemed to have lifted. Or perhaps it was simply waiting. But the club's shadow influenced an entire generation of musicians. Kurt Cobain, nearing 27, was terrified. He obsessively talked about not wanting to join that club. Ironically, his fear and depression made him more, not less, vulnerable. April 1994, Kurt dies by suicide at 27. Kurt Cobain and Brian Jones, separated by 3 decades, shared a terrifyingly similar trajectory. Both were musical geniuses who redefined their genres. Both were betrayed by those close to them. Both struggled with depression and addiction. Both felt they had lost control of their own artistic creations. Both died at 27 under circumstances that raise lingering questions. Kurt's suicide note specifically cited his fear of becoming a parody of himself, of losing the passion that had made his music meaningful. Brian would have understood perfectly. Both preferred death to irrelevance or artistic compromise. It's a tragic choice, but from their perspective, a logical one. July 2011. Exactly 42 years after Brian Jones, Amy Winehouse died of alcohol poisoning at her London home. 27 years. Amy had repeatedly predicted her own death. She had survived multiple overdoses. But her family, her fans, even she herself, couldn't break the cycle. Amy is frequently compared to Brian. Both were generational talents with massive addiction problems. Both were relentlessly hounded by the media. Both had toxic romantic relationships that accelerated their downfall. Both created extraordinary art about their own pain. And both died alone, despite being surrounded by people. There are scientific explanations for the 27 phenomenon. Statistically, it's the age when long-term substance abuse begins to have fatal consequences. It's when many untreated mental health conditions reach a crisis point. It's when the pressure to maintain early success coincides with the development of adult identity. But there is also something deeper and less quantifiable. 27 is young enough to be tragic, but old enough to have achieved something significant. It is the age where potential and achievement collide with mortality. Artists who die at 27 are frozen in their prime, never aging, never declining, eternally young and talented in our collective memory. Brian Jones, like the other members of the 27 Club, left a legacy that is impossible to complete. We don't know what music he would have created in his 30s, 40s, or 50s. We don't know if he would have overcome his addiction, if he would have matured, if he would have found peace. We are left with the eternal question of what if. But perhaps that unanswered question is part of his power. Brian Jones isn't an aging musician reflecting on his career in interviews. He's eternally the golden young rebel, the tortured genius, the betrayed founder. His story never has a resolution, only intensity. And that intensity, that incompleteness, is what keeps him alive in our imaginations decades after his heart stopped beating. July 9, 1969. Cheltenham, England. Brian Jones's funeral draws huge crowds. Fans weep in the streets. Hundreds of wreaths. The Rolling Stones do not attend. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards send flowers but remain absent, already in another city preparing for their American tour. Charlie Watts attends discreetly, avoiding cameras. Brian's coffin is carried by his childhood friends, not his bandmates. The service is brief and formal, nothing to reflect the wild and colorful life Brian lived. His father, now old and broken, weeps silently. His mother remains stiff, suppressing her emotions. Brian, who spent his life rejecting conformity, is buried in a completely conventional ceremony. The Rolling Stones released their album, Let It Bleed, in November 1969, 5 months after Brian's death. Brian played on several tracks, including his final musical contribution, the autoharp on You Got the Silver. But in the album credits, his presence is minimized. Mick Taylor, his replacement, receives prominent billing even though he played on fewer songs. This pattern continues in documentaries, books, and official Stones interviews. Brian is mentioned briefly, usually with the phrase, original founder of the band. Then it quickly moves on to the Jagger-Richards-Taylor era. It's as if the Stones are actively trying to erase their history with Brian, to rewrite their genesis without him at the center. In the 70s and 80s, when Mick and Keith spoke about Brian in interviews, their comments ranged from vaguely affectionate to subtly dismissive. Keith described him as paranoid and a pain in the neck. Mick was more diplomatic but equally distant. Neither fully acknowledged the debt the Stones owed to Brian. This narrative solidifies. Brian was an early talent who self-destructed, tragic but inevitable. The true creators of the Rolling Stones were always Jagger and Richards. Brian was simply another band member, replaceable like any other. This version of the story becomes canonical, taught in rock documentaries, repeated in superficial biographies. But some never accepted this erasure. Bill Wyman, the Stones' bassist until the 1990s, always insisted on Brian's crucial importance. In his autobiography, he dedicates entire chapters to correcting the historical record. Brian founded this band. Brian recruited us all. Without Brian, there would be no Rolling Stones. Period. Ian Stewart, the original pianist, expressed similar sentiments before his death. The sound engineers and technicians who worked on the early recordings described Brian as the true musical director. Even Mick Taylor admitted that when he joined the Stones, he felt he was filling impossibly large musical shoes. From the 2000s onward, music critics and historians began to re-evaluate Brian's contribution. Albums like Between the Buttons and Their Satanic Majesty's Request, where Brian contributed most heavily, were reconsidered as experimental masterpieces. His slide guitar work on early songs was recognized as defining the Stones' sound. Contemporary musicians began to specifically cite Brian as an influence. Jack White spoke of studying Brian's guitar parts. Beck mentioned Brian's instrumental experimentation as an inspiration. Tom York of Radiohead cited Ruby Tuesday, with its prominent flute played by Brian, as an early revelation of how non-traditional instruments could elevate a rock song. In 2004, Brian Jones, The Making of the Rolling Stones by Paul Trinka was published, the first comprehensive biography based on in-depth research. Trinka interviewed more than 100 people, including ex-girlfriends, collaborating musicians, and bandmates. The portrait that emerges is complex. Brian as genius and abuser, visionary and saboteur, victim and perpetrator. The book doesn't exonerate Brian from his faults, but it restores his central importance in the Stones' history. It shows how, without Brian's vision, his recruitment, his naming of the band, and his initial musical direction, the Rolling Stones simply wouldn't have existed. Jagger and Richards eventually became the creative leaders, but Brian was the essential catalyst. 2012, Crossfire Hurricane, an authorized Stones documentary, finally gives Brian more screen time. Archival footage shows Brian dominating the band in its early days. Old interviews where he is clearly the spokesperson. Moments where his musical genius undeniably shines. While he's still not the main focus, at least he's not erased. 2019. On the 50th anniversary of his death, several independent documentaries specifically explored Brian's life and death. Who Killed Christopher Robin? Examined the murder theories. 2005's Stoned, though a controversial dramatization, brought renewed attention to his story. Brian was finally receiving the recognition that had been denied him in life. Fans never forgot Brian. Cochford Farm, his last home, became an unofficial pilgrimage site. The swimming pool where he died was eventually filled in by later owners, tired of morbid tourists. But fans still visit the property, leaving flowers at the gate, miniature guitars, and notes of love and grief. In 2019, an official tribute was held in Cheltenham, his hometown. Local musicians played early Stones songs. Childhood friends shared memories. His sister, Barbara, now elderly, spoke about the brother she knew before fame transformed and destroyed him. It was poignant and sad, the recognition Brian should have received 50 years earlier. The story of Brian Jones is, ultimately, a story about how history is written. The winners, in this case, Jagger and Richards, who survived and thrived, control the narrative. The losers, especially the dead, are reinterpreted, minimized, or erased as it suits the winner's narrative. But the truth persists. No matter how much the Stones try to downplay Brian's importance, the historical record speaks for itself. Brian founded the band. Brian named it. Brian defined its early sound. Without Brian Jones, Mick Jagger would be a forgotten economics student and Keith Richards a pub guitarist. They owe him everything, even if they rarely admit it. Brian Jones died more than 50 years ago, but his story continues to resonate because it speaks to uncomfortable truths about genius, fame, and mortality. Genius does not guarantee happiness. Fame does not guarantee love. Talent does not protect against addiction, betrayal, or premature death. Brian left us a legacy of astonishing music, those slide guitar riffs that still give you goosebumps, those exotic instrumental arrangements that transformed simple songs into complex soundscapes, that vision of what rock could be beyond traditional American blues. But he also left us with a warning that the price of genius, especially when combined with insecurity, addiction, and betrayal, can be everything. The ultimate question about Brian Jones isn't how he died, though that mystery remains. The ultimate question is, why did we allow him to be forgotten? Why did we let the Stones rewrite their own history, erasing the man who made them possible? And now that we know the whole truth, what will we do with it? Brian Jones deserves to be remembered not as a footnote, not as a disposable early member, but as what he truly was: the founder, the visionary, the musical genius whose talent and tragedy are inseparably intertwined at the very foundation of modern rock and roll. His name was Brian Jones, and he created the Rolling Stones.